Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction and the opportunity to present here this morning. I'm going to try to stay off of the slides, but I'm just going to share just a couple just to give you a little bit of an outline of what we're going to be looking at here today and what we plan to accomplish. Obviously, a lot going on, so I tried to break this down and summarize it into just a few categories that I wish to touch on. Obviously, a lot more questions than answers now, as with most of what's going on in a lot of areas. So hope to just give you a primer on these 5 sections. And if you have any further questions or want to just chat about any of the things that we discussed here today, feel free to follow up with me after. So just to run down through the sections, I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-COVID, what the office market looked like pre-COVID. And I'm going to try to look at this through the prism of New York City, which is one of the largest, the largest office market in the country, and through a lot of the trends that we saw in New York City and are seeing now, try to give you a little bit of the narrative nationally. Obviously, there's nuances to each market, but I think the questions that are being asked all over the country about office space are no more relevant than in New York City. I'll run through kind of what we've seen on the timeline of COVID-19 over the past couple of months and how each month has had a very unique impact as it relates to office space. I'll give you a little bit of the market perspectives that exist now in the market from the general market perspective, and then a little bit more specific to landlords and tenants respectively. I'll talk a little bit about the practical reality of some of the things that we're seeing on the ground. Obviously, the hot topic is work from home. And a lot of people have quite a few takes on this one. And then a little bit of a surprise, but the last question that I think really sums up this entire discussion, and we'll get to that at the end. Just a little bit of a disclaimer, there are plenty of studies and surveys and articles and ideas and theories out there. They're all publicly accessible, and I don't think it would be worthwhile for me to pull those all together for you this morning. I think what would be most valuable, for the audience here today would be for us to just relay a little bit, even if it's anecdotal, but just what we're seeing on the ground through each one of these things. We're here this morning in Midtown. We've returned to our offices in the past couple of weeks. We've been quite busy, and I thought it would be most interesting for us to share, at least firsthand, what we're seeing. A lot of what's out there and published, it depends on the person, the bias of the person publishing it and the agenda of the person consuming it. It's hard to really cut through, and I think sharing a little bit more of an anecdotal perspective of what we're seeing would be worthwhile here this morning. So I will just start off pre-COVID, a little bit of what we saw, just since the last downturn, since 2008. Rents were obviously down in 2009 and 2010 from their peaks in 2008, following the financial crisis. And in New York City, and this graph is for New York City, in New York City, we saw an increase of about 30 to 40%, depending on the asset class, but there was a really, really huge pop in rents between 2010 and 2015, 2016. Over the last three and a half years, there was mostly a leveling off of rents. Concessions had softened a bit, but there was a huge growth in rents from 2010 to 2016. So coming into COVID, we were really at a plateaued rent basis, which, when rents plateau, it really means a softening, and that softening sometimes happens in terms of concessions, free rent, increased tenant allowances. So rents don't necessarily move, but a lot of the goodies that landlords give to keep those rents high, ticked up quite a bit. But overall, a plateau of the last 3.5 years, call it. What's notable about this plateau, and I guess kind of about the last 3.5 years from a demand perspective, is that in previously, when you had demand and you had vacancies being taken, they were being taken by occupiers, large financial services, government tenants, big banks in New York drove the market. But what was particularly notable about the last run was just the growth in co-working and flex space. And this accounted for significant amounts of the space being taken. As you can see here, there was dramatic growth. After that rent, pop that we saw, if you look after, 2016, most of that vacancy that was committed for and taken was taken by co-working and flex space. And what's unique about this is that yes, rents may have stayed constant and vacancy may have been absorbed and committed to, but these were not traditional occupiers. These are not companies that are taking it and putting employees in there. These are companies that were taking the space and reletting it. So in essence, you had something that was creating, it was taking space off the market, but putting it on a secondary market at a premium. So it's hard to really say that that was healthy, organic for the market. And I think this even in itself pointed to some signs of a little bit of weakness. What we can see is that, and it's become obvious now, is that there's a lot of challenges to this model. And this model and the success of this model really weighs heavily and is going to be an important point going forward as to how the office market fares. This is a lot of space. If you look at what, WeWork is committed to about 9 or 10 million feet. And through their commitments, we're going to have to see whether that maintains or not, but that could have a very weighty impact on the market. Just go to my next slide. So I'll go back to, just go off the slides for a little bit. I'll bring them back when I want to just illustrate a few points. So I'll run through the month by month, blow by blow in terms of COVID and what we saw. March 15th was obviously a pivotal point for the reactions to COVID. By the end of March, New York was mostly shut down. Through April, things were really tight. Businesses started to get a little antsy. The relief requests came into landlords who were also themselves trying to navigate. The tenants that got the most consideration in April were retail tenants. They were dead, shut down, couldn't do anything. So they really went to the top of the list in terms of landlords affording relief and having that sort of flexibility for them. Office tenants were more on a wait and see. Let's see how things go. What was most pivotal, I think, to supporting office space in general was May and the expansion of the PPP. The first round was a little naughty. Not every company got it, but once PPP funds were widely available, that was really the support for the office market. That gave companies funds to continue paying their rent, continue paying their leases. The New York REITs all reported very strong collection numbers. SL Green, Vornado, Boston Properties reported in the 90s in terms of their collection percentages. And what's interesting now is those funds are sunsetting for most companies, and to see how that continues. Every month has been a different anticipatory dread in terms of what the collection numbers look like. So far, they've held better than most people have expected them to, but I think a large part, something to watch, will be the PPP, which I think can have a very big impact on office collections and office rents. In June, we saw the protests really kind of set the city back in terms of momentum and excitement to get back to work. A lot of people held off. We had the phase 3 reopening, so although some companies or businesses were technically allowed to open, a lot of the retail spaces were still shuttered. If you were in Midtown, you saw that there was a preponderance of plywood over retail stores, which over the last couple of weeks has progressively come down. Still some stores with it who are not ready in full open mode. But that was really June, and I think dominated the sentiment in June was just the apprehension to come back to New York City. July, after the July 4th weekend, we had the phase 4 reopening, and I'd say that really kind of kick-started us to an extent. We've seen a big uptick, relatively speaking, to activity and people in the market. Leasing pipelines take time to fill, but we've definitely had many more tours, many more people coming back in July as opposed to June. And they really have, come out, and we're starting to see it with landlords too, that leasing pipelines are being refilled. These can take 2 or 3 months. The big caveat is tenants are being very deliberate about their decisions and trying to understand where things are going as much as they can. But at the end of the day, you do have companies that need space. They are gung-ho on having an office, and they're going to make commitments. Obviously, the demand is down a little bit, but you still have people that are in the market looking for space. And we were even doing deals through COVID with companies that were just, this is just something we'll have to, get past, but we want to return to the office as soon as possible. And we actually had a number of deals with tenants that took that perspective. Getting into perspectives, I'll tell you a little bit about the office market. a little bit more anecdotally, and I'll share some of what we're seeing. In terms of the supply and demand, everything is always a supply and demand. Pricing is a function of supply and demand. In the last, I'd say 3 or 4 weeks, as that PPP money has sunset, as people return to the office, as New York reopens, companies are now really taking a look at their real estate, and they're saying, hey, if I'm not using the office, should I really be cutting this check every month? Or we don't plan to return to the office at all, or I'm not sure when we're going to return to the office. We may as well try our hand at getting another tenant in there. So there's been a steady uptake in subleases coming available in the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks. About close to 2 million square feet in Manhattan alone has come available for sublet for all those reasons mentioned. June and July has really had that thaw on the market as people have gotten back, and some people it hurts to keep cutting that check. So those businesses are really looking at ways to reevaluate their lease commitments. I'd say anecdotally from the deals that we're completing, most recently, they're off about 20% from the pre-COVID ask. It's anyone's guess what that number will look like in a month from now. You have landlords on the one side who have a shot of optimism, but they're really on 2 ends of the spectrum and everything in between. You have landlords who don't want to reevaluate their asking prices. They want to just wait this out. They're long-term stable landlords. They do 5 and 10 and sometimes 15-year deals, and they say, look, I'm not going to drop the price for some fleeting incident in 2020 for the next 15 years. So they're really holding tight. They're not adjusting too much. Probably if you got in there and you negotiated with them, they would give you some relief to account for the current circumstances, but there's not a whole lot of budging on the asking rates. Then you have other landlords who are in a much more, you can call it vulnerable or eager position. And it really depends on what their current situation is like, what their debt is like, what their covenants in their debt is like, what kind of deals they can make. Sometimes lenders restrict what kind of rents you can take, what the lease expiration dates look like in their tenant roll. So you have a whole myriad of factors that go into that decision. So you have landlords on both ends. Some are like, let's just take a deal now, let's make it, who knows what's going to be tomorrow, and some that'll really want to try to wait it out. In terms of the kinds of tenants that we're seeing in the market, we see, from what we're seeing a lot of corporate size, larger companies putting any real estate plans on hold, being very deliberate about returning to the office, being very careful and sensitive for all the personnel issues that come with having people return to the office. In large part, the tenants moving with the most momentum are the smaller tenants, investment funds, family offices, people who really need an office. They're 5, 10, 15, 20 people. So there's not a whole lot of concerns to manage by way of personnel. And they are, in large part, I think, constituting what we're seeing in the market, even some small law firms, professional firms. And that's what we're seeing. I think just corporate, big companies are not sure yet what to make of this. And a lot of the conversations that we've been having are with principals, the larger companies who have said, we're just going to kick the can down the road till after Labor Day and reevaluate then, rather than get back too quickly and have to stop again or totally retrofit the space. So I'll give you 2 stories, also just anecdotes. Companies are very interested in what landlords are doing. If I go to my landlord and I tell them, hey, help me out, what can you do? So again, it's always going to depend on the landlord's circumstance, what kind of disposition they have, the way they do business, and what they see as important and in their best interests. We had signed a deal in February for a tenant build out. The construction happened. Space was due to be delivered July 1st. This was a 5-year deal. And the tenant really said, hey, look, I'm not ready to take the space July 1st. My people don't really want to come in until there's a vaccine, until the air is clear. How can we work this out? And surprisingly, the landlord was very accommodating to this. He had a great tenant on the lease. He didn't want to lose them. He didn't want to start the relationship off on the wrong foot. So the structure in that case that we did was we came up with a progressively increasing rent schedule for from the start of the lease until a year out. So for the first year of the lease, we added a year on. So it went from a 5-year lease to a 6-year lease. And the first year we did a very, very generous and progressive rent step-up schedule that allowed the tenant to take the space now, ratify the commitment, so to speak, but also give them the relief that they needed for their employees and to get them comfortable and into this space. So that was one circumstance. Another thing that we've been working on and having in a lot of our leases are COVID protections. So number one, tenants shouldn't have to take possession of the space, unless the air is clear. If there's a stay-at-home order, they shouldn't be forced to take the space, and we can postpone the commencement date of the lease. And the other thing is that there should be a rent suspension if there's another such government mandate for a stay-at-home offer. In terms of just tenants that are at the end of the road and not really looking to keep the space but want to get out, it's a business commitment. It's always difficult to get out of leases, and you owe that money to the landlord. But we're seeing a much more flexible approach from landlords now. In an ordinary market, they'll say, look, I'm going to go after the entity. I'm going to get the space back and re-rent it and try to make myself whole that way. Now, for companies that really need to get out or in trouble, there's not necessarily going to be money there for the landlords to go after. And they're not necessarily going to have the easiest time litigating against the tenant in today's market. And they probably have pretty poor chances at re-renting it. So I think a lot of landlords get this, and the conversations that you'd have with them today about rent relief, considering this environment and those realities, I think is a little bit different than you would in an ordinary market. So we're definitely seeing a little bit of give, a little more give than we would ordinarily expect on the landlord front. In terms of what tenants are thinking, most of the people that we talk to just have no visibility. They have no visibility into their business, what the prospect of their businesses are going to be, what the strategic necessities are for their business, and obviously the broader economic visibility, which no one really has. And that's pretty typical of downturns. Businesses have low visibility. They're loath to make long-term big commitments with that level of visibility, and that definitely has an effect on the real estate market in particular. Their options are right now to stay the course, keep going, look to get out of their lease, or if they have a lease expiring, to kick the can down the road somewhat and to renew short term. In terms of the tenant's outlook of what their needs will be, like I said, there's surveys galore, there's plenty of theories, there's plenty of experts who claim to know how things are going to evolve. But I think there's really no consensus. And with anything, it's very hard to take a broad brush and apply it. Every company is like an organism. They're like a people. Every company is different. For some companies, work at home is great. For some companies, it's a non-starter. For some companies, it's maybe a hybrid model. But I think you have to be very careful to kind of take a broad brush and say, this is going to be the future. I mean, we've had a long list of experiments in the office space market, and sometimes they've been bigger, sometimes they've contracted, but still been a part of it. So I think that work from home will definitely be something going forward to keep an eye on as it evolves. A lot of people talk about Twitter and technology companies and their indefinite work from home policies. I think you have to also read into these a little bit. A lot of these companies don't want to have the headache of bringing companies back to work, having another disruption. So they kind of just said, let's just take the rest of the year. You can work from home. None of these companies have reportedly been revisiting their commitments. And I'll tell you, FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, Netflix, Google, these companies have had the most voracious appetite for space in recent years behind co-working. Google's signed for 2 million feet. Facebook also for 2 million feet in Hudson Yards. So these companies are definitely making huge commitments before COVID, and there's no signs of them letting up or backing away from those commitments. It seems Google was one of the first to champion the whole unlimited vacation policy, and I can very well see work from home becoming something similar to that, in that you have the flexibility and ability to work from home as an added perk, and that's something I think that might be reasonable to expect in the future. I'll talk about a little bit of the practical reality we're seeing on the ground in terms of space designs and marketing. A lot of talk about companies taking more space for distancing or building space differently or outfitting space differently. We're not seeing a whole lot of that yet, at least structurally. A lot of topical overlays, queuing, sneeze guards, that kind of stuff, but nothing structural happening, at least from what we're seeing, both in buildings and common areas and within tenant spaces in particular. A lot of hygienic outfitting, obviously Purell stations, queue lines in the building, out the building, in our building, an RXR Realty building, big prominent landlord in the city. In all their buildings, they've installed thermometers at the entrance to the building, so you get your temperature taken when coming in. Many buildings have also adopted questionnaires for all visitors. Hey, answer these questions. Have you had fever? Been around anyone with fever? That sort of thing. And in terms of spacing, distances between people, a lot of companies have not mandated that everyone comes back to work yet, so it's not as acute of a concern. But in terms of marketing, we are seeing some plans, some floor plans that show the distance from A to B, but no one's really building or making investments in that sort of demand, at least not yet. Another thing that we're seeing is virtual tours. We actually started a platform, shameless plug, but virtournyc.com, where we shoot the entire space as a virtual tour. It's kind of like Google Maps inside your space. So you can click around, and that helps solve for a lot of the practical concerns, as well as hygienic concerns that might exist with bringing people through the space on a frequent basis. Sometimes the people looking to sublet the space are not there and they can't open the space. Sometimes the people that want to tour the space are either out of town or unavailable to congregate and come at the same time. And then you may have people in the space being shown who may be uncomfortable with people traipsing through. So this has been a very popular and in-demand service, virtual tours for space, and virtournyc.com. I'll touch on the work from home, craze. It's there's obvious benefits to it. It's definitely economical. Office rent is a large part of companies' spend. It's definitely time efficient if you don't have to commute back and forth to work. And for many employees, it's an added perk, the ability to work from home as a convenient schedule. The drawbacks are, just as well known, of concentration, collaboration, creativity. And the real question is, can the workforce work from home long-term? Can millennials who come out of college want to be in that environment, want to soak in the experiences and the osmosis that exists within corporate environments? Are they going to be comfortable working at home? Can they work from home, when they're in a 2-bedroom apartment with 4 roommates? Is that practical for them? Is it practical for young parents with children? And really, can you build a career from home? And I think all of these concerns around work from home really relate and boil down to one question. And the one question that I think all of this comes back to is, how does work from home jive with a company's competitiveness? And does this help companies be more competitive? Does it help them compete for and retain and attract talent? Does it help them with growth and innovation? Productivity you may be able to measure in a short time span, but the creativity that comes from collaboration is really not something you can measure over the time that we've had this experiment of work from home. And over the long term, I think companies are going to need to decide whether this work from home is going to mesh with their ability to grow and to innovate. And a lot of companies have always said that intangible factor of having the bump in of people in the office has been a key to their success. And really, this is not a 3-month question. You can look back and say, look at the last 3 months, or even the last 6 months, or maybe even a year. I mean, we're really going to need to see how this shakes out on the broader level. It'll probably take a little while to see how it evolves. And every company is going to constantly be going through this. And it's nothing new. Companies have always gone through this. Every time a company's lease comes due, or they're up for a strategic review of their office space, they're always asking, how can we do it cheaper? How can we get people, can people work from home? How can we do more with less? I mean, that's a recurring question. And the fact that we're all working from home now probably has given a little bit more oxygen to the fire. But I think that it's a timeless question. But it all just comes down to how companies will relate to this as it affects their competitiveness, both internally and in the market with their competitors. If you look back at history, we've seen some really huge announcements and commitments to work from home. In 2009, IBM allowed 40% of its 386,000 employees all over the world to work from home. But in 2017, they just scrapped it. They said, you know, look, revenue slumping. I don't know if that was a direct cause or not, but the experiment was withdrawn, and they mandated that everybody returns to work. Very similarly with Yahoo, and they brought their employees back in 2013. And CEO at the time just said, look, some of the best and most creative and biggest accomplishments in terms of our creativity and our collaboration comes from that intangible bump-in factor of people meeting each other and seeing each other around the office. And they said that it was just too much to pass up and not worth the cost of what they were saving.